preventing pandemics. We gave the big government the incredible ability to impose snap lockdowns on the people, which is a form of economic warfare and attack on our freedoms. That's not a hyperbolic overreaction to their tyrannic actions. That's the default position against any form of big government tyranny, no matter how much you think it's for your own good. The overreaction is shutting down civilization like it's an off switch, and without properly assessing the collateral damage to preventatively minimize it. From a single positive PCR test, governments around the world have set the precedence that when there's a single positive test in their corporate lab, they get to trap you. You may trust your local government to do that responsibly and ethically, but what about the corrupt foreign governments abusing this power? Globally, that's becoming an accepted common practice. And so, when you have a corrupt government abusing power through scientific fraud, what we have to do is demand independent investigations into their scientific process. In other foreign governments, the people don't have that investigative capability, and so it's our responsibility as privileged Americans to secure the freedoms of those populations being trampled by corrupt local and international powers. Notice how I said scientific fraud. It happens to be easy to commit scientific fraud when we're talking about the widely used COVID test called a PCR test, polymerase chain reaction, according to the creator of the technology and the instruction manuals of how to use it. It's a technology that is tunable and easily manipulatable on a computer screen, so we can't actually trust how they're being used by corrupt governments and healthcare systems. When they manually overtune the amplification of the tests, it will say you're positive for COVID-19, even from a minute fragment of non-viral RNA from any similar coronavirus you could have had in the last 10 years. We see that when there is a single positive PCR test or a cluster, they will impose a snap lockdown, which cripples the local economy and is a flex of absolute power that the local population gets conditioned or forced to accept. There needs to be a check of balance on the decision-making process to ensure the power to lockdown is not being abused. That seems like common sense, right? That common sense was also censored by overreaching big tech corporations and big government. More common sense is that we can't realistically expect to periodically and temporarily vaccinate the entirety of the general population against every virus that adds only 10% to 20% to the yearly death rate. That's a bad risk versus reward calculation and is not sustainable to continuously vaccinate the majority or entirety of a population every year. In many countries, we see that they're trying to vaccinate millions of people while having only a dozen or less COVID deaths. In the future, there will obviously be more deadlier biological threats, and so we need a better way of dealing with those threats rather than letting the government and slimy corporate interests with control of the scientific process to run the show while censoring and apprehending those that oppose them. It's objectively a financially and power-hungry motivated long game to make us forfeit our sovereignty to these bad actors. You can pretend like evil doesn't exist, and this has all been a random act of nature with no financial or power-related incentives, but that would be stupid of you. Clearly, the patterns of incompetent leadership and lack of accountability are a result of corruption at the highest levels. In many countries, you get assassinated or disappeared for talking against the government lockdowns or the pressured or mandatory vaccines. They're actually set to just release more scary variants to further traumatize their populations into submission. It's that easy after you've set the system to lockdown in place. That's the real world. That's not good, and so the default position is to find a different resolution to the problem without losing lives. Whether the problem was a manufactured crisis or not, there is an actual solution to the problem. The solution is that instead of trying to periodically vaccinate everyone for temporary immunity, we should use already developed self-administrable reusable tests that cost pennies and are 98% plus accurate. It would be statistically impractical for a highly infectious virus to spread in a community because anyone that tests positive will simply self-isolate until they test negative. You don't need everyone to be vaccinated. just testing negative with a legitimate test. It doesn't matter if a small portion of people don't use the tests or self-isolate appropriately, because enough people will comply. Only a majority of people need to comply for it to be effective enough to not make it possible for the infectivity rate to go exponential or increase substantially like we've seen. However, when people are actually scared enough and/or simply aren't distrustful of the historically corrupt government, then they will all comply without a problem. That's all it takes, trust in the system. Again, all we need to do is take tests to prevent the need to lock down or take vaccines. Again, if we have cheap, reusable, accurate, self-administrable tests that are updatable, like your iPhone receiving software updates over Wi-Fi, then we're able to prevent any future virus from shutting us down like COVID did. It doesn't have to be that technical either, because we can quickly make new tests for any new virus released or randomly occurring. Think about that. You agree we can't blindly let the corrupt governments of the world impose snap lockdowns on their brittle populations. You agree we can't realistically, periodically, and temporarily vaccinate the entire population against future viruses or trust other corrupt governments to do so legitimately. You agree we have to systematically launch independent regulatory investigations as a check and balance on any attempts to lock down by corrupt governments that aren't transparent. You agree the solution is to very simply just test ourselves before we go into public, which makes it statistically impractical for a virus to spread exponentially. If there is a hotspot that wasn't prevented because we got too comfortable post-COVID, then that locality can save themselves with this testing technology very easily without needing government overreach. If we're doing it, then it's working. We won't have to ever lock down again, and we shouldn't, because logically when you look at the global repercussions, we see that there is a lot more suffering taking place from supply chains breaking down. The global economy isn't able to withstand lockdowns without crippling hundreds of millions of people into starvation. And that isn't a new development. We've always known that to be the case. Now you agree our current global leaders made the wrong risk versus reward calculation, and our global response was intentionally sabotaged by corrupt interests. No, you don't agree. Okay, I'm sure it was all random. No need to think about it.